Welcome to the deep dive. Today's topic might sound a bit abstract at first. Mereology. It's all about parts and wholes.
But honestly, it's way more interesting than it sounds.
It really is, especially for any philosophers out there.
Absolutely. Anyone thinking about ontology or metaphysics or how we even understand reality.
You're going to want to pay attention because this gets to the core of it all.
Yeah. And what's so cool is that these questions, they aren't just like a modern thing. Medieval philosophers were already wrestling with this.
Yeah, big time.
Using their own frameworks and tools.
Right.
And you'll see their analysis of this whole thing often mirrors and sometimes even predicts the puzzles that we're still debating today.
I mean, it's uncanny how much it connects.
It is.
For this deep dive, we're going to be looking at some key medieval sources.
Right.
Boethius is a big one here.
Huge.
His work on division, his topics. And these weren't just theoretical exercises. They provided the actual language and structure for talking about how wholes are made up of parts and how we can break them down.
Absolutely. And, for a philosopher today, their terminology might sound a little different.
Oh, yeah.
But the rigor, the logical precision they were after, it speaks directly to the concerns that any philosopher trying to build, solid arguments is going to have.
Yeah. So let's zoom out a bit.
Okay.
For you, the listener, what we're trying to understand here is how these medieval thinkers approached this relationship between parts and wholes.
Right.
Across a huge range of things. We're not just talking about physical objects.
No.
Their mereological thinking extended to these big abstract concepts, like universals.
Like redness or justice or a triangle.
Exactly. The nature of properties, the kinds of debates that are still happening.
Yeah.
And it goes even further. They even applied it to the human soul.
Yeah.
Which is still, front and center in the philosophy of mind.
Absolutely. And this isn't just like a history lesson.
No.
By looking at how they tackled these concepts, we get fresh perspectives on enduring philosophical problems.
Right. It's like looking at the same puzzle, but from a completely different angle.
Exactly. And we're going to find some surprising stuff about identity.
Yeah, what makes something the same thing even when it changes.
Persistence. How do things even last, given that their parts are always, in flux?
Right.
And even, the very definition of whole. What does that even mean?
What does it mean to be one thing?
Exactly.
So if you've ever, thought about these kinds of questions.
Right.
About composition, identity, this deep dive is going to give you a pretty unique and hopefully pretty stimulating perspective.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's get into it.
All right. So to understand how these ideas developed, it's important to know, the context, the forums where this was happening.
Okay.
Medieval Mereology really took shape in logic.
Okay.
Specifically, methods called division, sometimes called diaresis or divisio, and collection, synagogge or collectio.
Right.
These techniques go all the way back to Plato, and both Neoplatonists and Aristotelians use them.
Oh, wow.
Initially, it was mainly in logic, as tools for defining genera by dividing them into species, and vice versa, for grouping things under bigger categories.
So it was a way of organizing knowledge.
Exactly.
Really.
Systematically. And collection would be the opposite.
Yeah.
You would be taking different things and showing how they belong together.
Right. It's showing how things can be unified under a concept.
Okay.
Now, this division thing, it was mostly about logic, refining definitions for arguments and classification.
Right.
But its implications went way beyond just genera and species.
Oh, interesting. So where else did they take it?
Well, Boethius, this super influential guy in the medieval West.
Oh, yeah, Boethius.
He expands this framework in his On Division. And he outlines two main types, substantial division and accidental division.
Okay, so for someone trying to get a handle on all this, what would count as a substantial division? So Boethius gives us three main ones.
Yeah.
First is dividing a genus into its species.
Right.
Like we've been talking about. That's classic logic.
Yeah.
Second, and this is where Mereology gets really interesting.
Okay.
Dividing a whole into its parts. And third, this might surprise you.
Okay.
Dividing a word into its meanings.
Oh, wow. So they saw a connection between the different meanings a word can have and the different parts a thing can have.
Exactly. They saw a parallel there.
That's fascinating.
And then we've got the accidental divisions.
Okay.
These are about dividing a subject by its accidents.
So Socrates and his properties.
Yeah, like him being wise or Greek,
Right.
things like that.
Right.
They also included dividing accidents by their subjects and even accidents by other accidents.
So they really had a whole system for understanding concepts and things.
Is comprehensive.
But for us, for Mereology,
Mm-hmm.
it's that division of a whole into its parts that we really care about.
Absolutely, that's where the real meat is.
Okay, so we've got this groundwork in logic, but medieval Mereology also shows up in another area, topics.
Right, loci.
Yeah. So for a philosopher out there, what's the deal with these topics?
Well, these were like self-evident propositions. They call them maximal propositions.
Mm-hmm.
And you use them to justify arguments.
Give me an example.
Like take Socrates is human, therefore he's an animal.
Right. Classic syllogism.
Right. That's valid because of this deeper principle. If you predicate a species of something, then you can predicate the genus too.
So the topics are like the underlying rules that make those inferences work.
Exactly. They're like the foundational principles.
Okay. And for our deep dive into Mereology, there are two topics that are especially helpful.
Right. The topic from the whole and the topic from the part.
And the topic from the whole had a few different subcategories, right?
Yeah, it did. Following the ancient tradition, the main ones were the universal whole and the integral whole.
Which shows that even back then, they knew that whole wasn't just one thing.
Right. It had different meanings.
And they were super sensitive to the different meanings of words.
Oh, yeah, for
The
sure.
medievals were all over that.
Like just the word totus, the Latin for whole. It could mean all the parts together make up X, or it could just refer to like the entirety of something. That kind of linguistic awareness probably pushed them to make their topics even more precise.
So they broke it down further.
Yeah, they did.
Okay, so what did that look like?
Well, beyond the universal and integral whole, they often analyze the topic from the whole 6 different ways.
6 ways?
Yeah, the whole in quantity,
Mm-hmm.
in a certain respect, in place, in time.
Wow.
Yeah.
So that meant they could talk about a lot of different kinds of wholes in a really precise way?
It did.
Okay, but we don't have time to go through all 6 of those right now. So which ones are the most relevant for us?
For Mereology,
Yeah.
it's the topic from the integral whole and the topic from the integral part. And within those, they really dug deep into whether these traditional maximal propositions actually captured how integral wholes and their parts really relate.
Right.
Not just logically, but like metaphysically too.
That's super interesting. So they weren't just taking these principles for granted. They were actually questioning them.
Exactly. And that kind of critical thinking,
Mm-hmm.
that's at the heart of philosophy.
So what were these maximal propositions that they were scrutinizing?
So for integral wholes, the proposition was, if the whole exists, then the part exists.
Okay.
And conversely, for the part. If the part doesn't exist, then the whole doesn't exist.
Wait, so if Socrates exists, then his hand exists. And if his hand doesn't exist, then Socrates doesn't exist.
Right.
That doesn't sound right.
Exactly. Those are claims that need some serious defending.
Hmm.
They don't really match up with how we normally think about things.
No, not at all. And the medievals knew this, right?
Oh, yeah. These weren't implications that they missed.
So they were aware of the problems.
Absolutely. And as we'll see when we get to the issue of persistence, these propositions actually triggered a whole bunch of debate
Okay.
about like the metaphysical consequences of these topics
Mm-hmm.
and the whole nature of parts and wholes.
Right. So they started to question the very foundations of their system.
Exactly. And that's how you get philosophical progress. You question the assumptions.
All right. So we've seen the logic behind all this. But now, for any philosopher out there who cares about what is, we need to talk about wholes themselves.
Right.
So what were the different meanings that they gave to this term, totus?
Well, as we've touched on, totus this s could just mean X is whole.
Okay.
Like it's complete, nothing's missing.
Like statue with all its limbs?
Yeah. Aristotle himself talked about this. He contrasted it with being mutilated, like something's missing.
Right.
But whole also had this distributive function.
Okay.
Like totus XSY could mean all of X is Y, meaning all the parts together as a whole are Y. That's what they called the categorematic sense. But then they also had a syncategorematic sense.
Wow, lots of categories. What was that one about?
Where totus XSY meant each individual part of X is Y. So it's a difference between talking about the whole collection and each member.
Okay, so 2 ways of understanding what all of X means.
Exactly. And lastly, whole could just mean something that's made up of things or can be divided into things.
So pretty basic.
Yeah, pretty straightforward. And that's often the sense they're using when they talk about collection and division.
Okay.
Now, this whole tradition of collection and division, it really shaped medieval Mereology. And because of it, they ended up classifying a ton of different things as wholes.
Like what?
Oh, all kinds of stuff. Universals. So like redness,
Right.
concepts in the mind,
Right.
material objects like a table, masses of stuff like water or gold.
Wow. So anything you could analyze in terms of parts they'd call a whole.
Pretty much, yeah.
Hmm.
But there were some important qualifications.
Oh, okay. Like what?
First, just because they called something a whole didn't automatically mean it was a real thing.
Mm.
Like Abelard, he's a super sharp guy.
Oh, yeah. Abelard.
He argued that things like temporal wholes,
Like days and weeks.
yeah,
Okay.
and universal wholes, they weren't really things, not like the substance is.
Right.
But he was still okay with treating them as wholes as long as we didn't, like, reify them, make them into things when they're not. This gets into some pretty interesting questions about our ontological commitments.
So you can talk about the parts of a day.
Right.
Without assuming that day is some kind of real thing out there in the world.
Exactly. And the second qualification was about different metaphysical commitments.
Okay.
So some philosophers made a distinction between true or proper wholes and quasi-wholes.
Quasi-whole.
Yeah. Like Occam, he famously argued that individuals aren't really parts of a species.
Okay.
And species aren't really parts of a genus.
Oh, interesting. So he's pushing back against that whole hierarchy idea.
He is.
Okay, so why did he think that?
Well, he said they're called parts, just figuratively, not literally.
Right.
So the species in general are only, like, wholes of a sort.
So it's more like an analogy. It's
Yeah.
not really describing how things are structured.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But keeping those qualifications in mind,
Okay.
we can look at the main Mereological categories that came out of this analysis. They had a ton of stuff that they considered wholes, but they usually organized them into three big groups: integral wholes, universal wholes, and potential wholes. And for anyone who's into the history of metaphysics, that category of integral wholes, that's where things get really interesting.
All right, let's dive into these categories then, starting with those integral wholes. What exactly did they mean by that?
Think of most of the stuff we see around us.
Okay.
Cars, houses, plants, people. Things that are made of physical parts. You can break them down into smaller parts. A car has an engine, a house has walls, a person has organs.
Right, right.
Those are the classic examples of integral wholes.
Okay, and they divided this category even further, right?
They did.
Based on how the parts are connected.
Right.
Continuous versus discrete.
Yep. And those distinctions are still relevant today.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Continuous wholes, their parts all share a boundary,
Okay.
like a bronze statue.
Right.
The metal is all connected.
Yeah.
Discrete wholes, their parts don't share a boundary. And then they divided discrete wholes even further.
Okay.
Into contiguous.
Contiguous?
Yeah.
What's that?
Where the parts are right next to each other, like the stones in a wall.
Right, right.
And disaggregated.
Disaggregated.
Yeah, where the parts are spread out.
Like sheep in a field.
Exactly.
Okay, so a fence would be contiguous, water would be continuous, and a pile of pebbles would be disaggregated. It's pretty intuitive.
Yeah, it makes sense. But here's where it gets philosophically interesting.
Okay.
The line between continuous and contiguous, it could depend on some deeper metaphysical stuff.
Oh, okay. How so?
Well, some thinkers said that only simple artifacts were continuous.
Right.
But then you've got guys like Abelard and Aquinas. They said that even complex things humans make, like wagons and houses, they're actually contiguous, not continuous.
Okay. So what's the difference for them?
They thought real continuous unity, that was reserved for substances.
So individual animals, plants, humans?
Yeah, things unified by a substantial form.
Okay. So that brings in this whole debate about the nature of unity.
It does.
And the role of form.
Right.
It's getting pretty deep.
It is.
So for a philosopher listening, why was form so important to them?
Well, Abelard, he thought only God could really fuse parts into a continuous unity.
Okay.
Humans, we can only put things close together.
Right.
Aquinas, he followed Aristotle's idea of hylomorphism.
Right.
And said that substances have this substantial form that's in every part of the whole.
Okay.
And that's what makes it truly unified. Artifacts, on the other hand, they only have forms that arrange the parts they already have.
So the glue that holds a substance together is different from the way an artifact is put together.
Exactly. And Aquinas had this great thought experiment.
Okay, I like the thought experiments.
He said you can figure out if a form is substantial by seeing what happens when you take it away.
Okay.
Like if you take the human soul away from a hand, the soul's the substantial form.
Right.
That hand wouldn't be a hand anymore.
It wouldn't even function as a hand anymore.
Right. But if you took the form of a car away from its parts, some of those parts, like the carburetor,
Right.
it would still be a carburetor.
Okay.
It could still work in another car.
So that really shows how important the substantial form is.
Yeah, it defines what a substance is.
The hand's identity is tied to the whole living being.
Right.
But a part of a car, it has its own identity.
Exactly. Now, they even put homogeneous masses into the category of integral wholes.
Okay.
Like gold or water, they'd be continuous.
Mm-hmm.
And scattered sums of things, those would be disaggregated.
Right, right.
But you won't find a medieval philosopher who believes in universalism.
Universalism?
Yeah.
Okay, what's that?
It's the idea that any random collection of things can be a whole.
Oh, okay.
Even Abelard, who was pretty open-minded about what could be a whole,
Right.
he probably wouldn't go that far.
Okay.
Mostly because of theological reasons.
Oh, okay.
They had problems with the idea that God could be a part of something bigger.
Right. That would mean God's not completely independent.
Exactly.
Which wouldn't fit with their theology.
Right. And their framework was pretty much Aristotelian.
Okay.
Where substances are like the best examples of unified wholes.
Mm-hmm.
Things that aren't unified by a substantial form.
Yeah.
They're less unified.
Okay.
The more random the collection of parts, the less likely it is to be a real whole.
So an organism, like Socrates, that's more unified than just some random objects thrown together.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they didn't just stop at material stuff.
No.
Some of them thought non-material things could be integral wholes too.
Like what?
Occam, he thought that complex thoughts could be wholes.
Okay.
And Aquinas even said that actions, like penance, had this integral structure.
So a thought or an act, it's a whole made up of different parts.
Right.
That's interesting.
And temporal things, like days, were also integral wholes.
But wouldn't Abelard disagree with that?
He would.
Okay.
He always had a different take. But these non-material wholes, they didn't really fit into those spatial categories.
Continuous or discrete?
Yeah. So temporal wholes were often called successive wholes.
Successive because their parts happen one after another.
Exactly. They unfold in time.
So a day is made of hours, which are made of minutes.
Right.
It's like a sequence.
Yeah, just like a complex thought unfolds over time.
Okay, so integral whole was a pretty broad category.
It was really wide-ranging.
But they had two other types of wholes too, right? Right. Universal wholes and potential wholes.
Yeah.
Let's talk about universal wholes.
Okay.
So we're moving away from concrete stuff and into the abstract.
We are.
What makes something a universal whole?
Well, like we mentioned, they saw universals, like genera and species, as a distinct kind of whole.
Okay.
They have these hierarchical relationships, like human and horse were both under animal.
Right.
And individual humans and horses, they fall under those species, and under the genus, too.
Right.
And this hierarchy raises some big questions about the relationship between particulars and universals. Like, are universals just collections of their instances?
Yeah. Is human being just the sum of all the humans?
That's the question.
Yeah.
And this hierarchy, they often described it using that language of collection and division.
That we were talking about earlier.
Exactly.
So how did they use it?
Well, they'd say you collect individuals into a species, and species into a genus, and then you divide a genus into species, and species into individuals.
Okay.
So it makes sense that they'd call the things you divide wholes and the results parts.
Right, right.
But most of them didn't think that universals were literally made of those parts.
Okay, so they weren't saying that the universal human being is literally composed of Socrates, Plato, and all the other humans?
No, not usually. There were some exceptions.
Oh, okay.
There's one philosopher from the 12th century. He really pushed for what they called a collection theory of universals.
Interesting. But most philosophers didn't agree with him.
No, the prevailing view was that universal wholes were different.
Okay.
They had a different nature than other kinds of wholes.
Right.
This is super important for understanding those debates about realism versus nominalism.
Yeah, those are big ones.
But Boethius, remember him?
Oh, yeah. He's kind of a big deal.
Yeah, in his On Division. He makes this distinction between dividing a genus and dividing a whole.
Okay.
But then when he talks about how to divide wholes, he says one way is to divide a universal into its individuals.
Oh, so he's saying dividing a universal is a way of dividing a true whole.
Right. And true whole, that usually meant integral wholes.
Right.
So he's kind of mixing up universals and what he called true wholes.
So even Boethius added to the confusion.
He did. It's like he was leaving it open for debate.
Which means later philosophers had to step in and clear things up.
Exactly. They had to develop even more precise distinctions to figure out what universals really were.
All right, so that's universal wholes.
Yep.
But there's one more category we need to talk about, right?
Right.
Potential wholes.
Potential wholes.
This is where things get a little weird.
It is. It's a real head-scratcher for anyone thinking about medieval ontology.
Okay, so potential wholes. For a modern philosopher, that sounds like we're talking about possibility, maybe different worlds.
Right. It kind of connects to that.
Okay.
But not exactly in the sense of just like logical possibility.
Okay, what did they mean then?
Well, Boethius, he's the one who introduced this category.
Okay.
He said these are wholes made up of powers or potentia, or virtues.
Virtues. Okay.
And they called them virtual wholes or potential wholes.
Right. And for them, potential meant something that could be actualized.
Exactly.
It isn't yet.
Right.
Like a line you could divide in half.
Yeah, but not yet divided. And that idea of like inherent capacity, it applies to these Boethian potential wholes too, like the soul.
Okay.
And its powers.
So the soul has powers even when they're not being used.
Right.
Like I have the power to see even when my eyes are closed.
Exactly.
That power is real. It's not just a possibility.
It's part of what the soul is.
Okay.
Now, what made potential wholes so tricky is that they seem to be particular things.
Right.
Not universals. But they weren't made up of their parts in a simple way.
Like a house is made of bricks.
Right.
Okay.
And the main example is the soul itself.
Okay.
Aristotle thought souls were forms.
Yeah.
And forms were usually simple.
Meaning no parts.
Right.
Okay.
So how can a soul have parts or powers?
That does sound like a contradiction.
It does. It's a classic problem.
Okay, so what did they do about it?
Well, they had to deal with the fact that the soul is clearly complex.
Yeah.
Especially the human soul.
Right. We think, we feel, we choose.
Exactly.
That's a lot going on.
It is. And it led to a lot of debate about whether a simple soul could really do all that. How could a unified consciousness do all these different things?
So some people thought that the soul must have parts.
Right. Some said that for different actions to happen, there must be different principles inside us. Others pointed to Aristotle's distinction between rational powers, which don't need a body part, and other faculties that do. And that led to some wild theories.
No, like what?
Like that we have multiple souls.
Multiple souls?
Yeah.
Ooh.
Or that the soul itself is made up of parts.
Okay, so they were really trying to make sense of how the soul could be both unified and diverse.
They were.
But Aquinas, he had a different view, right?
He did.
He was all about the unity of the soul.
Yeah, he was a Unitarian.
Right.
He insisted on one substantial form, one soul, for each living thing. But then he had to figure out how all these different powers fit into that.
Especially since